print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Erin, and for the next hour, I will be reading from the May 17th, 2026 issue of the New York Times Style section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. My first article, A What Would Jesus Eat Diet by Madison Malone Kirscher. Kayla Bundy likes to start her day with a cup of bone broth. She buys her milk raw, snacks on sardines, eats authentic sourdough bread, no commercial yeasts here, and generally cooks with locally sourced ingredients. On TikTok, where she has over 500,000 followers, she claims that her diet fixed her skin, her hair, and her depression, and she sells coaching sessions to help others with their diets. Bundy, a 27-year-old Christian content creator, might sound like your run-of-the-mill, clean eating type, but she believes her diet to be part of a higher calling. For 8 years, she has been a biblical eater, someone who consumes mostly foods mentioned in the Bible. She is part of a niche but dedicated online community trying to tie religious values to dietary needs. In an era when the Make America Healthy Again movement has pushed for more access to unpasteurized dairy products, stricter boundaries around ultra-processed foods, and new definitions for what counts as healthy food, alternative diets focusing on simpler foods are finding popularity, even when their proponents don't actively consider themselves part of the MAHA movement. Add to the growth member of GLP-1 users struggling to eat enough protein, and biblical diets can offer an appealing repackaging of certain age-old diet tenets. The new acting commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, who assumed his role last week, is a vocal champion for policies to remove chemicals from the food supply. I had never really thought to look to the Bible for a recipe book, said Bundy, who grew up in Michigan and now lives in Bali. But after cutting out refined sugar made her feel good, she said she started studying scripture from the lens of noticing what they are eating. She added, "Sin entered into the world through food, and Satan doesn't stop there. Food, for me, is really like a weapon of how I can fight back." Bundy is open about not having nutrition credentials, but she sells a $28 digital guide to biblical superfoods, as well as coaching sessions that start around $700 for a month, she said. She's not the only one. Like other health food influencers, the biblical eating proponents with popular accounts often sell products. Annalise Xavier, a stay-at-home mom who lives in Gainesville, Georgia, and posts biblical eating tips, said her Facebook following had jumped from scant thousands to over 300,000 in just a few weeks this spring. She sells a digital cookbook. The Bible says that God appreciates and celebrates small steps of obedience, said Xavier, 32, who added she did not consider herself part of the MAHA movement, but that some of its goals, like removing artificial dyes from foods, aligned with her own preferences. She said her approach boiled down to eating whole foods and cooking meals at home. She still buys some processed foods like pasta. Eating biblically, which can mean strictly sticking to the good book's ingredients, cooking from scratch, or anything in between, is not new. The Eden Diet, a 2008 book, offered weight loss and nutrition tips rooted in biblical teachings. Jordan Rubin's 2004 book, The Maker's Diet, was a bestseller, as was his recent book, The Biblio Diet, written with Josh Axe, a supporter of the Maha movement, and published last year. For years, some Christians have also participated in Daniel fasts, 21-day fasts based on the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, in which Daniel consumes only vegetables and water. There's also, of course, a long tradition of religious diets, such as keeping kosher or halal, or following a Levitical diet. Jesus himself presumably kept kosher. On social media, however, biblical eating has appeared to have a resurgence in recent months. A few years ago, the actor Chris Pratt talked on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert about completing a Daniel fast. In January, as part of his partnership with the prayer app Hallow, Pratt posted a video encouraging his followers to use the app to participate in a fast and prayer challenge. The bean heavy fast had made him quite gassy, he said with a laugh. Other celebrities, including Mark Wahlberg and Patricia Heaton, had been part of similar efforts with the app. Casper Schimmer, a college student in Amsterdam, said he sold coaching sessions for young Christian men looking to align their diet and exercise with their faith. It's not like eating healthy only is what makes a godly person, Schimmer, 20, said. He said he also focused on physical and mental fitness as part of a larger system of godly habits. For example, Sabbath as the original biohack. Jennifer Ayres, a religious education professor at Emory University, said the biblical food movement online seemed to show a focus on personal decision making. She added that the more collective and environmental analysis of what's happening in our food system is missing from some of the social media dialogue. Abby Stasier, a Christian dietitian who lives in Nashville, said much of her work looked at first like standard nutrition guidance. She often starts with clients by talking about the importance of breakfast, but then she'll refer to Bible verses, pointing, for example, to a scene in the book of John in which Jesus eats a balanced breakfast of bread and fish with his disciples. He's got carbs and proteins, Stasier 31 said. Tying dietary counsel to scripture offers an extra incentive, Stasier said. When it comes to meeting nutrition needs, Marion Nestle, one of the country's foremost nutrition policy experts, said that if people on the biblical diet consume ample calories and eat a wide variety of relatively unprocessed foods, they are probably doing just fine. She also described how wellness culture had been colliding with policy. The thing about wellness is that it's based on personal experience rather than science. It's what makes you feel good, Nestle said, adding, diet is about belief. We don't have a lot of belief systems left in this country. People are desperate for meaning in their lives. Xavier, the stay-at-home mom in Georgia, says she encouraged her followers to pause before eating, describing a person who might be deciding whether to eat a cookie. When you're in a craving, she said, have you ever thought to stop and pray? Next article is Storied Literary Salons Live On in a Welcoming Harlem Home by Ida Alami. The dozen or so guests celebrating Eid al-Fitr at Rashida Ismaili's home in central Harlem in late March were welcomed by the aroma of a home-cooked feast of fish, meat, yams, samosas, and vegetables. Though many of the celebrants lived in New York City, they were far from home: Zimbabwe, Zanzibar, Tanzania, Senegal, and Ivory Coast. Some were longtime friends or children of old friends. Others were more recently acquainted with Ismaili, a poet, a writer, a novelist, and a legendary salon hostess. They were all dressed in their most beautiful garments as they stood in a circle. Let's read Al-Fatiha and anything else you want to say, Ismailia said. As her guests read the first chapter of the Quran to themselves in silence, their palms up. Some people are not with their family members during Eid, and we are lucky to have somebody to spend Eid with, said Ismaili, who was born during World War II in Benin, then called Dahomey. Some sources have placed her birth year as 1941, but she said, I am comfortable saying I'm anywhere between 85 and 90. That's because, at that time, many in the region where she grew up didn't record their exact birth dates. Ismaili arrived in New York from Nigeria, her father's home country, by boat in 1957 with aspirations of becoming an opera singer. About a decade later, she began hosting the African Literary Salon, or Salon d'Afrique, while living on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. To Ismaili, the idea of a salon, intimate but also known for being intellectually elite, was the welcome house that usually happens in the yard or in a room that everybody reserves for guests, she said. Since the 1960s, Ismaili has made her many visitors feel not only at home in hers, but enlightened. That is in large part because she transformed her home into a hub for African literature. And the neighborhood boasts its own history as one of the country's foremost hubs of African American culture. In the early 20th century, Harlem was home to literary salons hosted by black luminaries like Aaliyah Walker, an arts patron, the writer Zora Neale Hurston, the activist Ruth Logan Roberts, and the poet and playwright Georgia Douglas Johnson. These salons, which ushered in the Harlem Renaissance, provided a safe space amid a segregated society for black intellectuals and artists to gather to debate and engage with one another through the 1960s. Ismaili's salon has brought together prominent international artists, musicians, and writers, including over the years Abdulaziz Gurnah, the Tanzanian British Nobel laureate, Nuruddin Farah, the novelist from Somalia, and poets Karapets William, South African, and Linton Kwesi Johnson, British Jamaican. They have shared meals, music, and books and discussed their work and creative process. I wanted to have this kind of intercultural dialogue from a Pan-African point of view, Ismaili said, so that people could realize how similar we were rather than how different we were. Passionate about building community, Ismaili believed that by creating a hub to give visibility to African literary giants in the United States, she is keeping alive the memory of movements and people little known by the mainstream. Over decades, she has continued building bridges among continents, hosting her salon several times a year. It was an opportunity to meet a real African director, writer, poet, or dancer in an intimate setting and just ask any questions, Ismaili said. Sometimes we would just be friends and eat an omelet. This has been a comfort for a person who has long lived far from the continent where she was born, and especially for a black woman and Muslim living in the United States. Ismaili said she found strength and protection in her faith and in tight community she had formed around her, and that community feels similarly about her. Sister Rashida is a pillar of the African community. She is a great connector and memory keeper, said Hisham Aidi, a political scientist at the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. She's devoted her life to bringing together different parts of Africa and connecting generations from the Black arts movement to anti-apartheid to Black Lives Matter. In the 1960s, Ismaili got involved in the Black arts movement, which poet Larry Neal once described as a cultural revolution in arts and ideas. It was then that she developed her talents as a poet, her work driven by themes of colonialism throughout the African continent and the civil rights movement in the United States. Ismaili has since published about a dozen books, both novels and poetry, and has a new poetry collection, Inshallah, coming out in the fall. She built the foundations of her New York life in Chelsea and the Lower East Side, where she lived with her husband at the time and held poetry readings, and then moved to Greenwich Village and Tribeca with her son after her husband moved to the West Coast for work. By 1984, she had moved uptown to her current home in Harlem. Being the sole breadwinner on a student visa was not easy, but it didn't deter her. She fostered relationships with other artists, including the saxophonist Archie Shepp and his family. As she became more politically aware, she enrolled in graduate school, where she earned a master's and then a doctorate in psychology with the intention of serving her community. Through her close friend Tom Feelings, an award-winning illustrator, Ismaili had one of her first poems published in The Liberator, a Black consciousness magazine, and joined the Umbra Collective, which comprised Black writers and artists who produced avant-garde poetry. Smalley's literary salon and her Kwanzaa celebrations, which tend to be day-long affairs, draw not only novelists and Nobel laureates, but also street performers, South African exiles, jazz musicians, said Aidi, who added that midway through she will disappear into her little writing cave and then reemerge an hour or two later, smiling. These days, Ismaili is working on a novel titled Turmoil of Truth, which will be second installment in a trilogy set in New York City. The vivid scenes and characters in the pages are drawn from her life. The trilogy began with autobiography of the Lower East Side, published in 2014, which chronicled the rise of the Black literary movement in New York after the Civil Rights Movement. According to a former neighbor, Latasha Diggs, Ismaili is also an archivist. She is a keeper of some of the most amazing stories tied to Black people in Harlem and the Lower East Side that Diggs and that needs to be known far more than she is, said Diggs, 56, a poet who has attended countless gatherings of hers. In fact, Ismaili's home has become a repository of invaluable mementos, African artworks, books, and personal belongings that connect her to loved ones and celebrate her inspirations. On the walls hang pieces of art from Morocco, South Africa, and other countries across the African continent. Some were gifts, others she collected on her travels. There are also photographs, some of artist friends like choreographer Sylvia Fort, at whose studio on West 43rd Street she studied dance in the late 1960s, and the Colombian-American dancer Elo Pamar, who has captured mid-leap on stage. Many of the photos come from her friend Joseph Nash, a renowned archivist of Black dance, whose archive she helped to preserve after his death. Almost all of them are gone now, said Ismaili, referring to her friends gazing out from her walls. Ismaili has saved a lot of their art, books, and when the proxy, she explained, you don't have permanent control over things. So after Nash died, she only had 2 weeks to preserve his photos. People have to protect their archives. I just took what I could. All those pictures would have been lost. Lately, Ismaili has been wondering how she will preserve her own legacy. Many who know her, like Diggs, are already doing some of the work. She is someone that I will push upon contemporary African writers, Diggs said. Do you know Rashid? You need to have tea with her. You need to have lunch with her. You need to know her. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times Style section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The next article, Brand Building and Another Trump Team Production by Vanessa Friedman. Since it was unveiled last weekend, the trailer for the Great American Road Trip, the 5-part reality TV show starring the Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy, his wife, and their 9 kids, has driven an unexpected amount of attention his way. The series, meant to encourage Americans to get in the car and see the country in celebration of America's 250th, has become a target for unhappiness over rising gas prices. Brutally out of touch, the former Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg decried on X, and the subject of a debate about departmental ethics. It is also the latest example of what is starting to look a lot like a trend toward celluloid self-branding by Trump officials and family members. After the ad campaign starring Kristi Noem during her term as Secretary of Homeland Security, which featured her as a cowgirl at Mount Rushmore, and after Melania, the documentary by the First Lady that chronicled her preparations for her husband's second inauguration, an exhaustive decorative detail, it was probably only a matter of time before other Trump figures seized the chance to package themselves for posterity. It makes sense. After all, this is a president who created and honed his image via TV. Little wonder those around him are trying to do the same via their own spin-offs. Why not a cabinet member whose resume includes The Real World and who was a Fox News contributor and a Fox Business host? The new series is created by a nonprofit called the Great American Road Trip, founded last year by Tory Barnes, a former lobbyist and executive for the U.S. Travel Association, and supported by sponsors that include Boeing and Google. Though Barnes did not respond directly to questions about who came up with the series, she did say in an email to the New York Times that the organization invited the secretary and his family to join us to increase visibility and to help inspire Americans to get out and see America. According to an X post by Duffy in response to the criticism, which he blamed on the radical, miserable left, the series was shot over a period of 7 months on weekends and on his children's spring vacations. This is not the first video appearance by Duffy in his role as cabinet secretary. He also recently headlined a PSA urging travelers to dress up for the airport in order to encourage civility. The golden age of travel starts with you, he announced, standing in a busy terminal dressed to make the point in a neatly tailored suit, glossy tie, and natty pocket handkerchief. That spot did not go over well with many flyers who voiced their disagreement on social media. It's unclear that getting gussied up would solve the upset caused by delayed flights, increasingly tiny seats, and other flying indignities. But it was merely a warm-up for the longer show, which has its debut next month on YouTube. This one features Duffy in a whole variety of dad outfits, straight from the Father Knows Best closet of the American mind, with his family as supporting characters down to their matching PJs. There he is in the Oval Office introducing his kids and the show's concept to President Trump as white-collar dad in Trumpian outfit of blue suit, white shirt, and red and blue tie. There he is in snowy Montana, leading his gang on snowmobiles in coordinated snowsuits. In Philadelphia, he's in a polo shirt and jeans, introducing his children to a role playing Benjamin Franklin. He hangs out in a plaid shirt with Kid Rock, a scene that also features Duffy's wife, Rachel Campos Duffy, a Fox anchor in an American flag sweater and matching American flag cowboy boots. The two met on the reality show Road Rules All-Stars. He wears a lot of shackets, and that's just in the show's 4-minute promo. In other words, this does not seem to be in the mode of the storied road trips of American pop culture mythology. Be they the grungy road trip of Peter Fonda and Jack Nicholson in Easy Rider, or the existential one of Chloe Zhao's Oscar winner Nomadland, it does not even seem to be modeled on the gaffe-filled comic road trip of the Griswold clan in National Lampoon's Vacation. It's more like Road Trip, the suburban nostalgia version. See the cars, which include throwback station wagons, redolent of Leave It to Beaver, and a big black Toyota SUV with Duffy, of course, in the driver's seat. It was conceived presumably to evoke the values wholesome, patriotic, and joyful, enumerated by Duffy in his post on X and meant to define the show and by association himself. As such, it effectively brands him as the every dad of the administration, complete with your weekend wardrobe. And when it finally airs next month, it may turn out to be less than actual reality TV rarely is, than about heavily messaged reality. In other words, marketing for history. Next article, Tenderly Tracking My Husband's Travels by Caroline Bailey. The third time my husband complained about not being able to refill his Subway card, I began to worry that the vending machine wasn't the problem. When I accompanied him the next morning, I knew it wasn't. My jaw dropped as I watched him squint and poke blindly at the screen, misreading prompts and misunderstanding the payment option buttons. Once he finally selected a dollar amount and tried to pay, he needed my help to insert his transit debit card into the correct slot. When he was prompted to enter his PIN, he typed in our zip code and got an error pop-up. See, he said, it doesn't work. I nodded, finished the transaction, and watched him pass through the turnstiles to work. Back on the street, I replayed the weird disconnects he had been having over the past year. The visual problems he blamed on dyslexia, the forgetfulness I attributed to undiagnosed ADHD, all the odd lapses at stores, banks, and in our own home that he claimed were the fault of other people, gadgets, and glitches. They had all seemed like random one-offs until now. 7 neurology exams, 2 MRIs, and 1 heartbreaking neuropsychology test later, my husband at 59 learned that he had Alzheimer's, a rare early onset subtype called posterior cortical atrophy. This means the plaque buildup in his brain started its dirty work with his visual processing before taking aim at his short-term and working memory. By the last appointment in a year-long series of humiliations for him and gut punches for me, we discovered he could no longer read properly, sign his name on a line, remember the date, or often why we were seeing a neurologist in the first place. The doctors were amazed that he was still working at a city agency and commuting. I shared their view about working, and it turned out that most of his office mates had been covering for him, but not about commuting. Like many native Brooklynites, he had been riding the subway his entire life. The system is backed into his long-term memory. He not only knew the lines and their quirky permutations, but also where to stand on the platform so the doors of the incoming train would open right in front of us. I constantly ribbed him for being a train nerd. It was no accident that our son's first toys were model subway cars. Within days of my husband's diagnosis, when he was gently forced to retire from his job, he decided he would use his free time to take the subway around the city to visit museums, walk around favorite neighborhoods, and catch films. I was working, and our son was in high school, so his options were to travel alone or with a companion I would hire. He shot down the later idea immediately. Though he acknowledged his diagnosis, he denied he was exhibiting any big symptoms yet. I knew better than to point out that he had just been let go from his job because he couldn't read or type. Believing Alzheimer's was his future and not his present was his lifeline. I had to hold on to it too. The idea of letting him explore alone gave me pause, and it raised full-on alarm bells with members of our family who thought a hard no was the only answer. However, it was a risk I was willing to take. Card machines aside, he still knew the subway system perfectly, and in my new role as caregiver, I didn't want to curtail abilities before they departed on their own. Let the disease be the thief, not me. But that didn't mean I wasn't going to install guardrails on his travels. I had learned from parenting circles about apps and trackers used to keep tabs on children as they got more independent. Upon joining several online Alzheimer's support groups, I learned that my fellow caregivers use the same technology to track their loved ones as they become less independent. I hadn't tracked our son, who wouldn't have minded if I had, but I knew I had to track my husband, who would mind. This meant setting up a surveillance system without him knowing. Under cover of night, I downloaded a tracking app onto his phone, buried it in a utilities folder, and turned off the notifications so he wouldn't see it. Next, I hid a tracking tag in an obscure pocket in the backpack he took everywhere. I couldn't hide a tag I wanted to put on his keychain, though, so I bought them for the whole family and put them on everyone's keychains because we all lose keys. When I did a demo to show my husband and son how they worked, my husband didn't notice that his tag was connected to my phone. Lastly, I put my credit card on his phone wallet so he could tap to pay and avoid using a subway card altogether. With my system in place, I wondered if I would feel guilty spying on my husband. But as I began tracking him, following his dot on a digital map, I felt connection. When his dot appeared at a favorite record store, I pictured him flipping through LPs. When his dot paused on Central Park's Great Lawn, I imagined joining him on the grass. If he knew I was watching, he would feel like I'd betrayed him. But I felt as though I had given him and us an extension of the routines that he had held us together for more than 20 years. For the next year and a half, despite continued decline in vision, memory, and word recall, my husband navigated nearly perfectly on trains and walks. I physically traveled with him at least once a week to verify my screen observations with my own eyes. It was a marvel to see that the same guy who could no longer operate the toaster or see a fork next to his dinner plate could still manage a 2-train ride to Citi Field without missing a beat. The biggest sign of his condition for me was the growing silence. We used to talk up a storm on our subway rides together, comparing notes on David Mitchell novels, laughing about the blizzard that resulted in me taking the subway to our wedding ceremony. Now he said little and stared blankly. It's awful missing someone while they're standing right there. Alzheimer's moves gradually, but then suddenly, a skill that's there one day, even 1 hour, is gone next. Without warning or evidence, it was ever there. Sometimes it will come back for a visit, but that can be months later and it's always fleeting. Knowing when to step in and tell a loved one with the disease that they can no longer do something because it's too risky is a game of chance we caregivers hate to play. Most of the members of my online support groups live in suburbs or rural areas and teeter back and forth on knowing exactly the right moment to take away their loved one's car keys and driver's license. For me, it's knowing when to take away my husband's subway card. That day is coming soon. In recent months, my husband's tracking dot has shown him switching train lines with no clear logic behind the transfers. His trip summarized is zigzag across neighborhoods in Brooklyn and Manhattan. Sometimes I can see that he has taken the D train straight midtown and back without ever surfacing, or that he takes a quick hop from an R to an F to a neighborhood where we used to live, and he'll just hover on the street corner for 20 minutes or so before coming home. Sometimes I'll be just about to leave work to go get him when his dot begins to move again, relieving me of worry for that moment, but not the dread that is more steadily telling me it's time. He comes home from these trips to nowhere but showing any signs of having felt lost or confused. When I ask him where he's been, he blurts out a location I know he didn't reach. I smile at him, say that's great, and feel competing tugs of fear, anger, loss, and agony. The trackers I have loved so much for telling me where my husband was on a map are now better at revealing the expanding distance between who he was and where he is headed. He won't need a subway card to get there. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times Style section on the new Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Next article is It's a Bookstore Without Books, So Listen Up by Yola Zizi. Ryan Min walked into a dimly lit bar on a Saturday morning in early May, claimed a seat on the right side, and placed an order. I'm really into trippy, mind-bending, twisty thrillers. Min, a 27-year-old software engineer in Manhattan, said, "What would you recommend?" The bartender presented him with an audiobook sampling of a Stephen King bestseller and a pair of cushioned headphones. This bar was stocked with a variety of audiobooks ordered based on preferred vibe rather than alcohol. Across the bar, Rachel Sun, 29, an accountant in New York, ordered a swoon-worthy Enemies to Lovers tale. The bartender obliged. When both had savored the previews, the bartender offered them each an audiobook on the house. The house in this case is the Audible Story House, a pop-up bookstore staged by the audiobook giant, which is owned by Amazon on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The over 6,000 square foot retail space, which is open through May, does not, of course, hold any physical books. People want not only to have IRL experiences, they want things that are tangible and not just digital, says James Finn, Audible's global head of brand and content marketing. The aim of this bookless bookstore, therefore, was to bring the concept and the intimacy of listening to audiobooks and podcasts and various productions to life in a different way, he said. Audible's take on the bookstore is a 3-story emporium complete with an event space for craft nights and author panels and a cafe selling matcha lattes and merch like baseball caps inscribed with the phrase, "I heard it on a podcast." The shop also has 2 large listening lounges equipped with surround sound listening booths where individuals or small groups can sample the audiobooks, and a listening bar where patrons can consult a story tender to get personalized recommendations from a list of titles available on Audible. There are bookcases arranged by genre, as in any bookstore, but instead of paperbacks, the shelves hold story tiles, translucent slabs featuring a rendering of book's cover. Shoppers who tap the tiles with their devices are led to a preview of the audiobook on the company's website. Although physical books still dominate the market, digital audiobooks are among the fastest growing segments in publishing, according to data from the Association of American Publishers. The share of publishers' revenues coming from digital audiobooks totaled more than 11% last year, up from 3.5% in 2016. This has led booksellers across the country to shift sales strategies in the hopes of winning over audiobook consumers. Libro FM, a service that allows shoppers to buy audiobooks directly from independent bookstores, has emerged as a tool to stay competitive against giants like Audible. Selling audiobooks in-store, however, has been a challenge for independent booksellers, which typically rely on promotions and giveaways to bring their audiobook offerings to the attention of shoppers. Strand Books, an independent bookstore with 4 permanent locations in New York, has gotten creative. Last year, the store gave away gift cards for the audiobook version of Steve Martin Writes the Written Word, collected written word works by Steve Martin with the physical copies it sold. And last month, it hid golden tickets in stores, and shoppers who found them won a year-long subscription to Libro FM. Amazon has done a pretty phenomenal job over the last 20 years of trying to put as many independent bookstores out of business as possible, said Kat Pongrace, the marketing director at Strand Books. Libro FM has given Strand a digital storefront that supports a healthy, independent reading ecosystem, she added. The purpose of Audible's bookstore, unlike that of a traditional retailer, is to drive new subscriptions to its platform rather than to allow for the purchase of individual titles. Customers new to Audible are encouraged to sign up for a trial of its service in the store. Audible's departure from the traditional bookstore can also be seen in its seemingly single-minded endorsement of low-hanging literary fruit. Over several visits, its story tenders frequently recommended classics, trending authors, and cemented bestsellers, in addition to Audible originals. The fiction bookcases were populated by popular titles such as Normal People by Sally Rooney and Yesteryear by Carol Claire Burke. While exploring the store, Natasha Woon and Jackie Altman, a pair of friends, tested out the listening booths, alcoves tucked among the bookcases, and a lounge on the basement floor, where they listened to Pride and Prejudice in the dark while loafing on a large daybed with other shoppers. Altman, 24, a neuropsychology technician in Boston, found the clinking of glasses, the chatter in the background, and the dialogue in the recording appealing, likening to the listening experience to watching a movie. Next article, As Soap Operas Wane, Suds Proliferate by Charlotte Druckmann. In late April, a sizzle reel of classic soap opera clips of divas falling down a grand staircase tumbled around social media and right into the Saturday Night Live sketch writer's room, inspiring the sketch Edge of Destiny. The May 2nd episode, featuring the host Olivia Rodrigo wearing a flip-feathered wig and a shoulder-padded jumpsuit, pushing one glammed-up cast member after another down the bouncing steps, each gave a more exaggerated performance than the last. The spoof of an old favorite soap trope, epitomized by the 1980s primetime show Dynasty, may have struck some as a random since network television phased out daytime serials well over a decade ago. In a broader sense, the parody felt timely. While promoting his new film, Project Hail Mary, a few weeks ago on the podcast, Happy, Sad, Confused, the actor Ryan Gosling was singing the praises of a soap operas he watched as a child. A clip of that conversation went viral, which not only resonated with other Zennials who grew up watching those shows, but also introduced soaps to a new audience. Younger generations are most likely familiar with the genre's over-the-top tenor, even if they never watched an actual soap opera. But the narrative convention arguably has been absorbed into our culture and whetted our appetites for even more high drama. It may just be that soap operas, as Gosling knew them, weren't meant to last forever, but instead evolve into something else, perhaps something bigger. Soaps were initially serial dramas that centered on the domestic lives of women, the earliest iterations and which were developed for radio in the 1930s to sell detergent to housewives. The originator, Arna Phillips, adapted soap operas for daytime television in 1949. They peaked in the late 1970s and the 1980s, when there were close to 20 daytime soaps running on 3 major networks. At their pinnacle, soaps were joined by primetime counterparts like Dynasty, Knots Landing, and Dallas, which were created to accommodate the schedules of working women and to appeal to their husbands, whom advertisers assumed would be watching with their spouses. Today, only 4 of those original soaps are still on the air, and 1 is available for streaming. The General Hospital episode featuring Luke Spencer and Laura Weber Baldwin's wedding remains the most watched in daytime history, with 30 million viewers in 1981, while The Young and the Restless currently has the largest audience in 2026, with 3.1 million viewers. Still, said Rebecca Buttigieg, who stars in the daytime soap The Bold and the Beautiful, I actually don't think that the genre is dying. I think we're having a little bit of a resurgence. Now, instead of obsessing over super couples like Luke and Laura, newer generations are fully invested in the brewing romance between Amanda Butula and West Wilson for the Bravo reality show Summer House, especially after Wilson wouldn't commit to Butula's bestie, Sierra Miller. And millions of viewers are turning into The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, the docu-soap, a paradoxical term that exists as a programming category, speaking volumes about this moment that homes in on a community of Mormon women who bonded on TikTok and whose toxic relationships, divorces, and throwdown fights have become tabloid fodder. Days of our real lives. We are seeing real life stories about real life people being mined for a new kind of soap opera, Strangers, the best-selling memoir by Belle Burden, that examines her husband's abrupt decision to make a clean break from his family during the pandemic shutdown, is being adapted for film. Ryan Murphy has created a genre out of turning recent history into stylized sagas, as he did with Love Story, the quintessential American soap, which depicted a very real tragic relationship between two very real people, Carolyn Bessette and John F. Kennedy Jr., the latter of whom hailed from a family that was suffered more than its share of tragedy. Viewers were so swept up in the series, they began mimicking the couple's style and visiting their old stomping grounds in Tribeca. I've always felt like every show that is hugely popular is a soap opera, said Buttigieg, who also co-hosts a podcast called Soapy, about the soap world. At the end of the day, we can have all these big stories, she said, but it's really about what's happening between two people and whatever that relationship is. And that's where I think there's drama. Buttigieg could just as easily be talking about the heated rivalry, the smash hit about two hockey players who fall in love, or Hunting Wives, the over-the-top Netflix series about a New England woman who relocates to East Texas and becomes mesmerized by a gun-toting Christian socialite clique. And then there's Murphy at his Murphiest with All's Affair, in which he built a starring vehicle for Kim Kardashian about an all-woman law firm. And reality dating shows like Love Island returning to Peacock on June 2nd, and all of the Real Housewives franchises, according to Greg Reichart, a star of Days of Our Lives and Buttigieg's co-host on Soapy, are as sudsy as any traditional daytime drama. I don't know any group of friends that have as much conflict, Reichart said. Beyond that, it's aspirational. If you are someone who aspires to have Birkin bags and a beautiful home and fancy cars, that is not a coincidence. Bravo's ubiquitous and talk show host Andy Cohen has discussed his inspiration for the Real Housewives franchises, citing All My Children and Knots Landing. Now, thanks in part to those Real Housewives and to families like the Kardashians who made the public believe you could become famous simply by having money and filming every aspect of your life, the line between soap and reality has blurred. Regular people are now starring in the story of their lives, using social media or related platforms as their proverbial stage. Melodrama queens? Well, at this point, there is no reality without histrionics. Docuseries about real estate listings or those working on luxury super yachts are rife with interpersonal drama. It's what people want, including the actress Sarah Michelle Gellar, whose career took off after her adolescent star turn as Kendall Hart on All My Children. Recently, she complained on Page 6 Radio, much to Andy Cohen's horror, that this past season of The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills was boring and slow. If it's more catfights than she craves, she need only tune in to the endless updates about the beef between the podcaster Alex Cooper and the influencer Alex Earl. In the same way, characters on soap operas never really die, neither does the convention of soaps themselves, especially as a larger cultural phenomenon. The daytime drama as a genre may have contracted, but in 2025, CBS introduced Behind the Gates, the first new soap since 1999, and The serial storytelling involving a fixed social ecosystem of intergenerational characters, heightened stakes, incredible plot twists, the longing of star-crossed lovers, conniving nemesis, thwarted heroes, and power struggles, has bled into other types of programming, whether that's procedural dramas like The Lincoln Lawyer, period pieces like Bridgerton, or prestige drama writ large. Michael Jackson, the Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright whose off-Broadway musical White Girl in Danger was a send-up of soap operas, recognizes parallels between the performative behavior driving civilians and politicians alike and the daytime dramas he grew up watching and worked into his scripts. I think of soap operas as melodramas, Jackson said. They prioritize plot over character, which is to say that the character will conform to whatever the plot. People, their villain or victim, the reality stars and content creators who have catapulted to fame often hew to those archetypes and they are rewarded for it. Too real? Watching current events unfold can feel a lot like following a daytime drama, Jackson said, and sometimes those delivering the news become players themselves. People who deliver the news are also the popular characters, Jackson said, referring to a love triangle between Robert Kennedy Jr. and the journalists Olivia Nuzzi and Ryan Leza. It's like Melrose Place meets Days of Our Lives meets Scandal. It's all soap within a soap within a soap. Soap operas have always been a great escapist outlet, so it's little wonder this hyper-reality has people seeking out these shows as a fantasy-based distraction. The result has been a proliferation of serial dramas like Yellowstone, and its many spin-offs, including the latest, The Madison, and The Morning Show. Jackson has avoided most of these newer shows, but admits he has found comfort in The Gilded Age, a historical drama about the wealthiest New Yorkers in the late 1800s, because he says it feels like the closest to watching an old-school soap opera, even though you can still feel the presentism. The actress Donna Mills, who played the alpha villain in Knots Landing, said she found Netflix's small-town romantic dramas Virgin River and Sullivan's Crossing a salve amid the barrage of news alerts she received throughout the day. She was also made aware of an uptick of interest in Knots Landing, which ran for 14 seasons from 1979 to 1993. It became available on the streaming platform Plex toward the end of 2024, and it was popular enough that it was acquired a few months later by Amazon, which is currently available for purchase. Its success prompted Mills and her former co-stars Michelle Lee and Joan Van Ark to start the podcast We're Not Done Yet, on which they reminisce about working together and interview former castmates like Alec Baldwin and Brian Austin Green, as well as their Hollywood contemporaries like comedian Sandra Bernhard and the Dallas star Linda Gray. More recently, the entirety of the extant daytime soap The Bold and the Beautiful and its defunct competitor All My Children became available for streaming in Canada. But what people say about Knots Landing and watching it again and again is that it feels like home, Mills said. It feels like they know these people, and so they're interested in their lives, and why not indulge in these old-fashioned soaps? By comparison, they seem like a less provocative form of diversion than some of their own more recent iterations. Maybe when things are a little more copacetic, we can lean into more challenging, scarier stories, Reichardt said. And when things are challenging in the world, maybe the escape for less severe. But for now, no need to burst the bubble. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times Style section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Next article is A Kiss and a Proposal on the First Date by Tammy LaGorche. Dr. John Henry Cook III hadn't meant to appear bare-chested on Sylvia Rosemary Otten's iPhone when he called her for a chat last July. It was 7:45 a.m. and Cook, who was home alone with his dog in Leesburg, Virginia, was having trouble facing the day. I was lying in the bed my wife had died in, he said. I was feeling busted by sorrow and I just wanted to talk to Sylvia. An accidental push of the FaceTime button sent more than his voice through the ether. Otten, who was visiting her daughter back at the time in Phoenix, Maryland, was taken aback. He said, "Good morning, love," she recalled. I was stunned. She was equally stunned a day later. when hours after their first kiss, he proposed. Auten, 85, and Cook, 90, first met in May 2011 when Auten and her late husband, Forrest Hanvey, became patients at Cook's concierge medical practice in Leesburg. Hanvey, who died in 2024, had known Cook since the 1950s when both were midshipmen at the U.S. Naval Academy. A friendly relationship between the former classmates soon extended to their wives, Auten and Agnes Desiraga Cook, whom friends knew as Di. Both couples would routinely see each other at USNA alumni events, and after Cook retired from medicine in 2017, they met up occasionally for group lunches with Navy friends. I got to know Di, who was a wonderful watercolor artist and wonderful person, Auten said. When Di died in April 2025 of cardiac arrest, the friendship between the two surviving spouses deepened. Auten is an author and educator. Before she moved to Fairfax, Virginia in 1969 with her first husband, a nuclear physicist. Her doctorate in mathematics, education, and statistics is from the University of Maryland. Auten and David, who died of a cerebral hemorrhage in 2003, raised a daughter, Allison Russo, now an anesthesiologist at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, and the mother of Auten's two grandsons, ages 6 and 2. The Autens also had a son, Timothy Lee, who died in 2014. Auten taught in Chicago classrooms before she was promoted to her first position in educational leadership in the 1970s. In 2005, she retired as Director of Staff Development for Fairfax County Public Schools. Auten now teaches personal finance classes at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, part of George Mason University. She also advises women on beginner stock market and investment strategies. Her advice extends to navigating romance and relationships too. The Last Embrace, Caregiving for a Beloved Spouse, a self-published 225 book, was written after she spent a protracted period caring for Hanvey, who died after a fall at home in Fairfax Station. The Wondrous Embrace, Finding Love in the Sunset Years, also self-published in 2025, is meant to inspire hope among other older people maybe soaring on the chances of finding love. Auten met Hanvey when she was well into her 60s and he was 70 in January 2005. They married the same year in September. One thing I do not want is for anyone to feel discouraged when it comes to love or otherwise, she said. Before Cook earned his medical degree from Yale, he was a Polaris submarine commander in the Navy. During the Cold War, he served in nuclear submarines. He married Di in 1957, the day after he graduated from the Naval Academy. Military service had been a Cook family legacy. His father was a Marine Corps first lieutenant. He was born at Marine Corps Base Quantico in Virginia. With Di, he had a daughter, Elizabeth, and two sons, John and Harrison. His 5 grandchildren range in age from 24 to 30. When Hanvey was declining in 2024, Auten wasn't always certain she understood his needs. In those moments, she would ask Hanvey if he wanted to talk with someone else. Invariably, it would be, "I want to talk with Jack," she said. Cook picked up the phone every time. On May 17, 2025, Cook held a memorial for Di at St. James Episcopal Church in Leesburg, where they had married almost 70 years earlier. Soon after he died, Auten sent the family a condolence card and tucked a printout of the 1934 poem Immortality by Claire Harner inside. "I thought it might comfort Jack," she said. At the memorial, he told her how much he liked it, but Auten knew his grief was a death poetry could do little to assuage. "I saw the pain he was in," she said. Less than 2 weeks later, she was surprised when he texted her a handwritten poem. He had taken the original poem I sent him and created a poem as if Di were reading it to him, she said. "I was so taken with what I sent a poem back to me as through Forrest were writing to me. Both poems touched on how they shouldn't feel alone, how their spouse's spirits wouldn't leave them." Auten was planning a June 2025 celebration of life for Hanvey at the time. "Jack had done such a wonderful job with Di's. I asked him if he would come over and look at my ideas." She said over lunch the effects of his loss were apparent as they had been at the memorial for Di. "He was still zombie-like with grief," she said. Compassion and a sense of hopefulness about helping him through his pain led to a shift toward tender new feelings. On June 29th, as Cook was leaving the celebration of life for Hanvey, he bent down to hug her and whispered, "I love you," in her ear. What was astonishing is that without a moment of hesitation, I responded, "I love you too," she said. The next morning, he sent her a text message, "Bravo Zulu," a Navy term for well done. She asked herself If his declaration of love at the service meant little more than appreciation for this celebration honoring his friend, they didn't speak again until July 11th, when Auten was preparing to get in the shower at her daughter's house and Cook was shirtless and in bed. Auten checked that only her face was visible when she answered the early morning call. They hung up with the plan to meet for lunch the next day at Auten's house in Fairfax Station. At 1 o'clock, there he was holding a mini orchid plant as a gift. She said, he stepped into the foyer, stepped into my arms, and gave me a long, deep kiss. 2 hours later, on a deck overlooking a lake on the property, he proposed. At the memorial for Hanby, Cook's feelings for Auten had taken him by surprise. When you've been in a long-term loving marriage, you always have your feelers out for your spouse, he said. When the spouse dies, those feelers that had been intertwined wither away. For Cook, maintaining hope that they would one day regenerate and intertwine with someone else had been a challenge, but the moment I kissed her, it's almost like I put the key back in the lock, he said. My life started again. On May 9th, Cook and Auten married at St. James Episcopal Church. The Reverend Chad Martin officiated a traditional Christian ceremony for 90 guests. Auten wore a dusty rose ankle-length dress from her closet, the same dress she had worn to marry Hanby. It brought back loving memories, she said. Cook wore a dark gray suit with multicolored tie and his trademark red socks. Both had entered the church from a side door, then sat in chairs arranged in front of the altar, standing only to say their vows. At our age, stability is an issue, Auten said. I wobble well, but I didn't want to wobble up a long aisle. After a kiss, to mark the start of their married life and a careful recess to the church parish for a buffet lunch, they reflected on the resilience of the heart. Even if the days ahead are few, both of us would like others to have hope for the future, Auten said. Since he and Auten fell in love, Cook said life has been delightful. Beauty and music surround us all. He added, if you listen for it, you'll hear it. If you don't, you'll miss it. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from the May 17th, 2026 issue of the New York Times Style section. We read from the New York Times Style section every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Your reader has been Aaron. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have the USA Today. Following that at 2 o'clock is episode number 13 of Ira Gershwin by Michael Owen. Stay with us for these readings and more. You're listening to the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, broadcasting daily readings 24 hours a day of newspapers, magazines, and books to area people who are blind or have a print disability, who are provided reading radios. Radio Readings broadcast signal is provided at no charge by WNED. Radio Reading Studios are at 1199 Harlem Road in Cheektowaga, between William and Clinton Streets. Radio Reading's website is nfradioreading.org. For more information on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, call us at 716-821-5555.
The Niagara